Love it or hate it, sometimes you need to paint an edge. I'm going to show you how. Hello everybody, my name is Justin. Welcome back to the studio. Currently I'm working on a project that requires a great deal of edge painting. So I've been doing a lot of edge painting, and I thought I'd give you my tips that I've been thinking about while painting these edges. So before getting into all of the tips and tricks that I have, one thing I'm going to mention is that this is going to be in the application where you're edge painting a chrome tan leather. So everything you're going to see in this video is Allrin Sully, which means if I do end up getting an edge paint on the surface, which happens, it can easily be wiped off with either crepe rubber or an alcohol wipe. If you're using a standard veg tan like a Butero or a Pueblo, if you get edge paint on that surface, I don't know if it's coming off because that veg tan is going to absorb the paint. Whereas with a chrome tan or a finish like this, it's going to resist it because that's what the leather is supposed to do, is resist the water damage, which is why it's a good application for bags. So edge preparation is, as usual, probably the most important step when you're painting an edge. You really want to make sure that that edge is nice and flat, that there's no extra little fibers sticking out from maybe the layers that you've glued together. There's no excess glue sticking out that could impact the layering of that paint. If I've just freshly cut this edge, like in this sample piece, I've got my liner here that I'm going to trim to length. So I'm getting a nice fresh cut edge. So all I'm going to do is go through with some 220, maybe 350 sandpaper, just with my hand to smooth it out to make sure that surface is nice and uniform. If there's really a lot of excess stuff on there, you can go to a Dremel to make the process a bit faster. I actually did use that Dremel on the shoulder strap for this bag that I'm working on, just because of the length of it. Way more efficient to get that nice and smooth with the Dremel. I also have a padded lining in the middle, so that lining material didn't cut as clean as I wanted it, so it was sticking proud of the leather surface. So taking the Dremel to sound that right back was way more efficient than trying to do that by hand. One other thing about edge preparation to consider is adding an edge crease. I find when you add an edge crease before edge painting, because it rounds over the corner, it's easier to clean up the edge and get a nice smooth transition from the face of the leather to the edge paint. It also means that if you do end up getting some edge paint on the surface of the leather, which is almost inevitable, even a little bit, using your crepe rubber to clean off that excess edge paint is really easy with a creased edge. Without a creased edge, you go straight from the face to the edge to the actual edge paint, and getting that a clean transition I find is really difficult. If you don't have that crepe rubber, you can also just use a little cotton swab or a Kleenex or anything like that, dipped in some alcohol, and wipe that edge paint right off. Now when it comes to edge paint application, there's a bunch of different methods and tools that you could use to actually apply that edge paint. For me, that's going to be determined by the actual brand of edge paint you're using and its viscosity. So I prefer to use one of these little tools. This is just tools, use that term loosely. It's literally a wooden dowel that I've put into a pencil sharpener and brought it to a point. The reason I like this tool over one of those rollers or maybe using an awl is because one, it's a little bit more comfortable to use this larger dowel than a small awl. I also find that using this tool, the application process of the actual edge paint is more accurate and more precise than use one of those edge rollers. I personally find when using the edge roller, I have less control with the paint that's coming out on the sides. Whereas with this, if I need to be really precise, I can just get a small amount of edge paint on the tip and I can apply it where I need it. If I want more, I can just fill up the end a little bit more and it spreads nice and evenly. So the one really big factor when applying the edge paint is the actual viscosity of the paint. Is it thinner? Is it thicker? How does it actually roll off of your applicator. I find the thinner edge paints are more difficult to control because it's thinner. It's going to spread easier, but it's going to get everywhere easier. So I actually prefer a thicker edge paint, which is why I'm using Vernisse right now. I've just started using it. I really like it. And I find that because it's more viscous, it applies more evenly. So when you apply it to the edge, it almost feels like it self-levels almost, versus a thinner edge paint that you can see the bumps if you've applied more paint on one section versus the other. That's another important factor, is how level you apply that edge paint. You want to make sure you apply it in a nice even thin coat as consistently as possible. Any little bumps where you've added more edge paint and less edge paint, all of that will just have to get sanded down. So once you have that edge paint applied, you have to wait for it to dry. Now the dry time is going to be very different depending on the humidity levels in the environment you're in. It's going to depend on the actual type of edge paint that you're using. You can use little space heaters to help speed up that drying process. One thing I find if you use those space heaters is that it can sometimes dry the surface before the paint that's underneath it. So if you've applied a very heavy coat, then you could be in a situation where the top feels dried. You start sanding it, you come through that layer that isn't dry, and then it starts gumming up, and then you ruin the whole edge, and you get to take all that layer off and basically start over. So considering that dry time, that's why I prefer to add light layers and build those up, and then just do my very last layer as a thicker edge coat. That's also why I like Vernisse, because I find that it dries really quickly and really evenly. I've used other edge paints where the top surface has dried, but the layers underneath haven't. And then I got to resand it all off because it gums up, and then it's just a mess and it's impossible to fix. So I kind of touched on this earlier. The tools and technique that you use for applying that edge paint is going to be a combination of different factors, from the edge paint you're using to the thickness of the edge that you're actually painting to what simply just feels comfortable. So like I said, I prefer using a wood dowel with a little pointed end on it. This technique is probably a little bit slower than if you use one of those edge rollers, but I find the results are way more consistent for me to use this technique of just with using the wood dowel to apply the paint. The tool selection is also very important because, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you get a nice even application of that layer of paint, and sometimes I find the rollers or other applicators don't do a very good job of applying a nice even layer. Finally is finishing off your edge paint. Some edge paints dry glossy, some dry matte, so that's an important factor when you're looking at your edge paint. Which type of finish do you want? I find that with Vernisse, what I can do is, if I want a more matte finish, I can lightly sand that surface and then just do a very, very light coating of beeswax just to add a bit of protection, and it still maintains a matte finish. If I want a more polished surface, what I can do is do an alcohol wipe just before adding that beeswax, and I find that really seems to level off that surface and almost bring up a bit of a polish. Not sure if that's actually what's going on, but it certainly feels like it. And then I add a fairly heavy coat of beeswax in multiple applications and then polish it with my canvas cloth like I would normally do with a properly burnished edge. I find that's the best way to get a nice glossy edge if that's what you're looking for. But again, that finishing process is really going to depend on the paint that you're using and whether that paint's going to respond well to that beeswax finish. So those are my 5 tips for edge painting your leather goods. Now, my process as it is right now is sanding the edge either by hand or with a Dremel if I need to, adding a very thin coat of edge paint just to make sure that I've got that level surface. So I'll add the very thin coat of edge paint. It'll dry very quickly. I can sand it down very lightly, and I can see if there's any really low spots. If it is, I'll do a heavier sand and basically completely remove that first layer of edge paint. Once I know that surface is nice and level, I'll add my first proper layer of edge paint, which is a little bit thicker than the light layer I started with before, as it'll completely cover the edge and you won't see any of the underlying leather. Once that edge is dried, I go back with about 220, 320 grit sandpaper, sand that by hand, and make sure that surface is perfectly even. If I go through most of the edge coat that I put on, so be it. My goal here is to make sure that the edge paint that is still remaining is perfectly uniform and there's no low spots. The low spots you can usually tell because it's shinier than the surface that you're sanding. Once that first layer is all sanded down, I'll go ahead and add another medium level layer, making sure that everything is nice and coated. Let that dry. Again, come back with another, using that same sandpaper, so using like a worn 220, a worn 320, and then make sure you level off that surface once again. At that point, it should be pretty even. You should have complete coverage over the leather. You shouldn't see any leather at this point. It should be nice and even. You'll likely see some shiny bits kind of right in the middle of your layer that you're edge painting. You're just going to keep sanding lightly until all of those shiny bits are gone and it's all a nice matte surface. So 2 applications. After that, my third, usually this is my final one. This one I'm going to add a much heavier layer of paint to make sure that I get all of that coverage, and it's going to even out any little discrepancy in that edge. If it is there, having that thicker final edge coat I find really helps, because then once that dry, I can come through with that same used sandpaper, level it off, and then usually it's coming off evenly and the entire surface is nice and smooth, nice matte finish. After that, I'll come through with an alcohol wipe just to level off that surface and prepare it for the final polishing. So to get that polish, I usually come in with about 1500 grit after that alcohol wipe, level it off, should be nice and uniform. Once I'm done with that 1500, I come in with the beeswax, very lightly apply it to that edge paint. I don't want to damage the edge paint. Come in with my canvas cloth, polish up that beeswax, and then add as much beeswax as I'd like until it brings it up to the polish that I'm looking for. I will do a proper walkthrough video of actually how I edge finish step by step. This video is just kind of more of an overview and kind of tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. I will go through the entire process from start to finish to show you exactly how I edge finish. That will be in a future video. Once this commission is done and it has been delivered, I'm going to be redoing the bag for you, multi-part video series. I'm not sure how long it'll take. It'll probably take a while because this is a pretty in-depth project. I will have my own custom plans for this because there's a lot of modifications I'm making to it to fit my style and things that I've learned while making this very popular design. So stay tuned for that. If you want to see that process, subscribe below. If you want to support me in all the work that I'm doing here on this channel, you can hit that join button. I've got 3 different levels for subscriptions if you'd like to do that. Also, be sure to check out my supplier links below. A bunch of them have given discount codes, Norfolk10 at checkout. That gets you 10% off your entire purchase. So I want to say thank you to them for extending that offer. I do have affiliate links with Lonsdale Leather. So if you use that link and make a purchase, I do get a small commission. I also have my standard affiliate links with anything that you see from Amazon or any of the Xtool products. Right now I'm using the Xtool S1 as my laser in the studio. And I think I said in every video, this has been an absolute game changer for me in terms of how I work. Now, for this type of project, I have not used the laser to cut out any of the parts, but I have made it. But I have used it to cut out all my little templates. So I can laser at these templates. It's got my stitch marks, so I can give myself reference points. And each piece comes out exactly as it's been designed. Double-sided tape on the back of it, stick it on the piece, trace it. It's been amazing to have this laser in my studio. It just really elevates the work that I'm able to do and brings in a very significant level of consistency to the work. Even if I'm not actually cutting the pieces on the laser, just having these templates that I can cut out with all the necessary marks, it's been amazing. So if you have any questions, comments, let me know in the comment section below. And with that, we'll see you in the next one.